He starts in Jerusalem and, of course, is on his road to Damascus, where he sees Christ and comes to know him in a personal way. He visits Damascus, and his sight is restored by a man named Ananias. He then spends 3 years away in Arabia. After he returns from that trip, he comes back to Damascus, is lowered over a wall in a basket, and returns to Jerusalem, where no one trusts him, but Barnabas takes him to Peter, where he spends only 15 days. At the end of this time, he is in the temple, has a vision, and God tells him to leave because they won't accept his message about taking Christ to the Gentiles. So he leaves abruptly and heads back to Tarsus, where he probably spends the next 8 or 9 years until Barnabas comes to get him and takes him to Antioch. At that point, he spends time there working just in the church, just as an average guy, and he is chosen around 46 AD or so to come south to Jerusalem with Barnabas to basically bring a monetary gift to the starving Jerusalem church. At the end of that time, they go back to Antioch, and Paul and Barnabas say, time for the first missionary journey. They travel to Cyprus, which is their first stop, do some miracles there, and then travel on to a city that's not on the map, but is named Perga, then Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. When they are finished, they retrace those steps and go all the way back to Antioch, where, after such a long missionary journey of a year and a half, they're quite hungry, so they go to the Pizza Hut, and that's where they find Peter eating in the non-Gentile section. He rebukes Peter and decides, wow, if they're having so much trouble here, they're probably having trouble back in Galatia. So he writes the letter back to them, and then the church council convenes, and he heads off to Jerusalem for the Jerusalem Council. Now, let's do it all over again, this time from the book of Acts. So in Acts chapter 9, he leaves Jerusalem for Damascus, heads out into Arabia for 3 years, but actually none of that 3 years is recorded in the book of Acts. If you only read Acts, you'd think that as soon as he gets saved, he preaches in Damascus and then heads right back here to Jerusalem for this 15-day visit. Now, while he's there in Jerusalem, Barnabas takes him to Peter, but the fact that he has the vision and has a vision, he's in the temple, we don't actually learn that until Acts 22 when he's retelling this story again. As far as Acts is concerned, Acts 9, he heads off to Tarsus and we never hear from him again. Of course, he goes to Antioch, and according to the book of Acts, the next time we see him is when he returns from Antioch to Jerusalem for the famine relief visit, and that's in Acts chapter 11. At the end of Acts chapter 11, curiously, the start of chapter 12 in the book of Acts is the story of James being killed and Peter in prison. At the very end of that story, you have this little statement that says, oh, and by the way, Barnabas and Saul returned back to Antioch, the end of chapter 12. So then it's time for the first missionary journey, which of course retraces these steps. This is Acts 13 and 14, and when they come back, the confrontation with Peter in Antioch isn't told of in the book of Acts, and neither is the writing the letter to Galatians, but the next thing you do see in the book of Acts is the famine relief visit in Acts 15. Now we'll try to do it by year. So when we start out from Jerusalem, we're probably talking about 35 AD. This 3-year trip, or 3-year visit to Arabia, probably takes him to around 37. You might think that's 2 years, but it's probably part of the year 35, part of the year 36, and part of the year 37. Again, it's a kind of a Jewish way of keeping track. So over the span of 3 years, he's there. When he comes down to visit in Jerusalem again, then we're probably right around the year 37, which is important to us because this is still before the year 40, which is where the story of Cornelius and Peter occurs. So all of this happens even before then, and we'll talk about the implications of it later. Spends the 15 days there, goes back, and we don't hear of him again till about the famine relief visit, which is now around 46 AD when they come down and spend that time. When they head back to Antioch, the first missionary journey, we go to Cyprus, probably 47, and to the rest of the place 47, 48, and we get back in the fall of 48 and write the letter to Galatians, and then the trip back down to Jerusalem is probably in the fall of 49. Now, one more time, and that is with the book of Galatians in mind. In Galatians chapter 1, Paul talks about his trip to Damascus, then says in verses 16 or 17, you may have to check that for certain, that he spends 3 years in Damascus, comes back down, and only spends 15 days in Jerusalem. In fact, this is how we know the 15 days, just from the book of Galatians chapter 1. Then it tells us that they didn't know anything about him there, and he went back to Tarsus, where he spent the rest of his time. The famine relief visit probably is in Galatians 2, 1-10, and here is a whole discussion about Titus and not being circumcised and having a private meeting where they ask him not to remember the poor, which perfectly fits with this famine relief visit in 46 and 47. Then, of course, he does do the first missionary journey, but this is not recorded in the book of Galatians because, in fact, they were part of it and knew of it and no reason to mention it. The only other thing that's recorded is in verses 11 to 14, where he meets Peter at the Pizza Hut in Antioch, and this is a major discussion in Galatians 2, as I said, verses 11 to 14. Again, the letter is sent, and that's where Galatians ends, because I don't think the Jerusalem Council had happened yet at this point. So, I hope that all is clear, and if it's not, you can listen to it again.